The morning after we buried my grandmother, my sister stood in the doorway of her house with both arms stretched wide, screaming that every single thing inside belonged to her, and I just stood there in the driveway, holding the only piece of paper that actually mattered. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened in that driveway didn't start the morning after the funeral. It started 40 years before I was born, in the particular way some grandmothers love, fiercely, quietly, and with far more precision than anyone around them ever realized. My name is Celeste. I want you to know who I was before that driveway, because who you are before the crisis is the only thing that explains how you survive it. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, in a house that was always slightly too cold in winter and slightly too loud in summer. My mother, Sandra, was the eldest of 2 daughters. Her younger sister, my Aunt Beatrice, came along 5 years later. They were raised by my grandmother, Eleanor, in a narrow 2-story house on Birch Lane that smelled permanently of coffee cake and old books, a house Eleanor had bought with her own money in 1971, paid off by herself by 1989, and never once put anyone else's name on. Eleanor was a retired postal worker who kept her finances in a leather ledger she updated every Sunday after church. She drove the same car for 19 years. She wore the same wool coat from October through March every single season. And every birthday, every Christmas without fail, she tucked a handwritten note inside whatever gift she gave you. Not a Hallmark card. A note. Her actual handwriting, in blue ink, in the careful cursive of a woman who learned penmanship as a serious subject. I still have every single one of mine. My cousin Renata, Aunt Beatrice's daughter, does not have hers, because Renata returned them. Sent them back in an envelope with no explanation when she was 19 and decided Eleanor was, and I am quoting directly from a text she sent my mother, too old-fashioned to bother with. That detail matters, keep it. I was raised to understand that Eleanor was the kind of woman you did not take for granted. My mother, Sandra, had her flaws, and I will not pretend otherwise. She was loud where Eleanor was quiet. She was impulsive where Eleanor was measured. But the one thing Sandra got absolutely right was teaching me to sit with my grandmother, to actually sit, to ask questions and wait for the full answer, to not check my phone, to look at her face when she talked. My mother did that because her own mother had raised her to do it, and it is the single greatest inheritance I received before any legal document was ever signed. Renata was not raised that way. Aunt Beatrice, and I am trying to be fair here, the way you try to be fair about people you have watched cause damage across decades, Aunt Beatrice was a woman who believed that love was demonstrated through money. Expensive gifts, lavish gestures, restaurants with cloth napkins. She showed up to Eleanor's house twice a year, Christmas and Eleanor's birthday in April, with enormous wrapped boxes and the kind of entrance that required everyone in the room to notice her arrival. Eleanor always thanked her. Eleanor was unfailingly gracious. And then Eleanor would wait until Beatrice left, and she would say to my mother, quietly, the same thing every single time. Your sister means well. Which, if you have ever loved someone careful and precise, you know is the most devastating possible assessment. Renata inherited everything about her mother and amplified it. She was 2 years older than me, which she treated as a form of seniority that applied to every situation, including ones where age had absolutely no relevance. She had a talent for arriving at the exact moment something good was happening and positioning herself at the center of it. And she had spent the last decade of Eleanor's life perfecting a particular performance, the devoted granddaughter. She visited more in Eleanor's final 3 years than she had in the previous 15 combined. She brought flowers. She posted photographs on Instagram with captions about cherishing these moments and my queen and the strongest woman I know. She took Eleanor to doctor's appointments, twice that I counted, compared to my 37, and made sure to mention both of them loudly and repeatedly in family conversations. I am not telling you this so you will hate Renata. I am telling you this so you understand the architecture of what was about to happen. Because Eleanor saw it too. Eleanor saw everything. I just did not know yet how thoroughly she had prepared for it. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, the way she had lived. She was at home, in her own bed, in the house on Birch Lane. My mother was with her. I was 40 minutes away and got the call while I was in the parking lot of a grocery store, sitting in my car with a bag of oranges in the passenger seat, and I drove the 40 minutes without stopping and sat with my mother in Aliner's kitchen for 3 hours before either of us said much of anything. Renata arrived 4 hours after that. Wearing a black coat and sunglasses, she kept on indoors for most of the evening, and the first full sentence she said was, "I just need a few minutes alone in the house to feel close to her." My mother said, "Of course." I watched Renata walk through Aliner's living room slowly, touching things. Her hands landed on the mantel clock, the blue ceramic lamp, the framed photograph of Aliner in her postal uniform from 1974. I watched her the way Aliner had taught me to watch things, quietly, with patience. I did not say anything. Not yet. The funeral was 4 days later. Aliner had prearranged everything, which was exactly the kind of thing Aliner would do, down to the hymns and the flowers and the specific scripture she wanted read. All we had to do was show up, which should have been simple. Renata turned the reception into a referendum on grief by crying louder than anyone in the room, including my mother, who had just lost her mother. At one point, a neighbor who had known Aliner for 30 years came to offer my mother condolences, and Renata stepped smoothly in front of her to receive them first. I watched my mother's face during that moment. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at me. And I nodded. We had developed this language over years of Renata and Aunt Patris. It meant, "I see it, I know, not now." Not now was the operating principle of that entire week. The will reading was scheduled for the Thursday after the funeral, at the office of Aliner's attorney, a man named Gerald Park who had been her lawyer for 22 years. My mother knew about the appointment. I knew about it. Renata and Aunt Patris had been informed by the attorney's office directly because they were named in the document. Wednesday night, Renata called me. Not my mother's, me. She was warm, warmer than she had been in years, and my stomach tightened the moment I heard her voice on the line at that particular pitch. "Celeste, I've been thinking, before we go to the lawyers tomorrow, maybe we should talk about the house." I asked her what about it. "Well, Grandma always said it should stay in the family. And I was thinking, since I'm between places right now and you have your apartment, maybe the most natural thing would be for me to move in. Just to keep it from sitting empty. I could pay a small rent until everything gets sorted out." I want you to hold that sentence. Between places right now. Renata owned a condo in a suburb 40 minutes north. I knew this because she had posted extensively about purchasing it 18 months earlier. She had not sold it. She was not between places. She was doing math. I told her we should wait and see what the attorney said. The warmth in her voice cooled by about 10 degrees. "Of course, I just thought we could be adults about this before lawyers get involved." I told her I was sure we would be adults about it. I got off the phone, sat in my kitchen, and called my mother. My mother was quiet for a moment when I told her what Renata had said. Then she told me something I had not known. She told me that 3 weeks before Aliner died, Aliner had called her and said, "Sandra, whatever happens after I'm gone, don't let anyone touch anything in this house until Gerald says so. Not a lamp, not a spoon. Do you understand me?" My mother said she had asked Aliner why. Aliner had said, "Because I know your sister, and I know her daughter, and I did not spend 50 years building something to watch it get picked apart in a week." My mother had not told me this until now because, she said, she had hoped she was wrong about where this was going. She was not wrong. Thursday morning. Gerald Park's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, with the kind of waiting room that had old magazines and very good carpeting. My mother and I arrived together. Aunt Patris and Renata were already there, side by side on the upholstered bench, Renata with her phone in her hand, Patris with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression that telegraphed calm entitlement so clearly it was almost a second outfit. Gerald came out, shook hands with everyone, and led us into a conference room with a long table and a window overlooking the parking garage. He was methodical and clear and utterly without drama, which I appreciated. He explained that Alina had updated her will 14 months prior with him, that the document was signed, witnessed, and filed correctly, and that he had a duty to read the current version in its entirety before taking questions. Renata asked if that was strictly necessary. Gerald looked at her over his reading glasses and said yes. He read. Alina had divided her financial accounts and personal effects with the precision of a woman who had spent decades thinking it through. To Aunt Patris, she left a specific collection of jewelry, including a pearl bracelet and her mother's engagement ring, and a sum of money that was respectable and clearly chosen with care. To my mother, she left a different set of items, including a quilt she had made herself, a collection of first-edition books, and her own financial accounts, which were more substantial than any of us had known, because Alina had been quietly, steadily saving for 40 years without mentioning it to anyone. And the house on Birch Lane, and everything inside it, she left to me. To me specifically, with my full legal name and a clause in Gerald's careful language that made clear this was not an oversight or an equal share to be divided. It was a direct and singular bequest. Alina had left the house, and its entire contents, to her granddaughter Celeste, unconditionally. The room was extremely quiet for a moment. Then Renata said, "That's not right." Gerald looked at her. He asked her to clarify. "That's not right," she said again. "Grandma would never have done that. She always said the house should stay in the family." Gerald explained that the house was staying in the family, specifically, in mine. Renata turned to me, and I watched her face do the work of running through every available option in real time, discarding the ones that wouldn't play, and landing on the one she had clearly used before. Celeste, her voice went soft. "Wounded, you know Grandma loved all of us equally. I was as close to her as you were. This isn't fair to the whole family. I want to stop here because I know some of you have been in that exact chair with those exact words aimed at you, and I want you to know what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was something more like a deep, tired recognition. The recognition of a person who has been watching a particular performance for years and has finally reached the scene where the curtain comes down. I told Renata I was sorry she was upset, and that we should let Gerald finish. Aunt Patris said nothing. She sat very still and looked at the table and said absolutely nothing, which told me she had known this was possible and had not prepared Renata for it, and that was a choice she had made and would have to live with. Gerald finished. He answered questions. He explained that the will had been properly drafted and witnessed. He explained the timeline for the transfer of the property. He gave my mother and me copies of the relevant documents. He said his office was available if we had further questions. Renata had further questions, all of which circled the same drain. Could this be contested? What grounds might exist? Had anyone verified Alina's mental state at the time of signing? Gerald explained that Alina had been assessed as fully competent at the time of the update, that he had conducted that conversation personally as part of his standard practice, and that Alina had been, in his experience of 22 years working with her, one of the most lucid and deliberate clients he had ever served. Renata stood up before he finished the last sentence and walked out of the conference room without saying goodbye. Aunt Patris stood, thanked Gerald in a voice that carried no actual warmth, looked at my mother with an expression that contained 20 years of complicated history, and followed her daughter out. My mother and I sat there for another moment, in the suddenly spacious quiet of that conference room. Then my mother said, "She prepared for this." She meant Alina, and she was right. Alina had prepared for this 14 months ago, at a quiet appointment with Gerald that she had driven herself to and never mentioned to anyone. She had known. She had watched, and she had known, and she had done what Alina always did. She had taken care of it properly, in advance, in writing, with a witness, without drama. I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't known was tight. Friday morning. The day after the will reading, I drove to Birch Lane to begin the process of understanding what I had inherited. Not to take anything yet. The legal transfer would take several weeks, but to make an inventory the way Gerald had suggested so I knew what was there. I had a notebook. I had good intentions. I had the key Alina had given me 3 years earlier when she said, matter-of-factly, you should have this in case. I pulled onto Birch Lane at 9:15 in the morning. There was a moving truck parked in front of Aliner's house. Not a small truck. A full-size 26-foot moving truck with citywide moving and storage painted on the side, engine running, two men in navy blue t-shirts standing by the back. I sat in my car for 10 seconds. Then I got out. Renata was standing in the front doorway of Aliner's house with both arms spread wide, braced against the doorframe on each side, and she was wearing the expression of someone who had decided that physical occupation was a legal argument. Behind her, through the open door, I could see boxes, stacked, taped, labeled in black marker. The blue ceramic lamp was already in a box I could see from the porch. Aliner's mantel clock was wrapped in moving paper on the floor of the entryway. She had started the night before, or possibly that same morning before dawn. She had been that efficient. "This isn't your house yet," she said. "Legally, the transfer isn't complete. I have every right to be here." I want to be very precise about what I felt in that moment, because it was not what anyone expects. I did not feel rage. I did not feel the hot swell of wanting to scream at her, or push past her arms, or call her every name I had never let myself say. I felt clarified. The same kind of clarity that comes right before a very important decision, when all the noise drops away, and you can see the shape of something with perfect precision. "Renata," I said, "step back from the door." She did not. She told me that the house contents should have been split equally among the grandchildren, and that Aliner had clearly been manipulated in her final months. And here I want to pause and tell you what it felt like to stand on my grandmother's porch and hear someone describe my careful, meticulous, legally precise 81-year-old grandmother as a woman who could be manipulated. Aliner, who kept a leather ledger. Aliner, who drove the same car for 19 years. Aliner, who had instructed Gerald Park to document her mental competency as a standard precaution, because she had known, 14 months ago, that someone might say exactly this. I let Renata finish. Then I asked her a question. I asked her who had arranged the moving truck. She said she had called them last night. I asked her whose credit card was on file with citywide moving and storage. She said hers, obviously. I said, okay. She narrowed her eyes at me. She was braced for an argument. She was ready for one. She had probably been rehearsing it since she walked out of Gerald's office the day before. I didn't give her one. I walked back to my car, got in and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Gerald Park. Gerald picked up on the second ring. I explained what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment, then he told me what I needed to know. That the removal of property from the estate prior to legal transfer was a matter I could report, that I had documentation from the will establishing my ownership of the house's contents, and that he could have a letter sent to Renata's attorney by end of day making the legal position very clear. He also told me that, as the named beneficiary, I had standing to speak directly to the moving company as a third party claiming interest in the property. The second call was to Citywide Moving and Storage. I got a dispatcher named Leo. I explained that I was the legal heir to the property at the address where his crew was currently stationed, that I had documentation from an attorney establishing my ownership of the contents, and that his crew was being directed to load property that was not the legal property of the woman who had contracted them. Leo asked me to hold. Leo was back in under 2 minutes. Leo said, "We're going to need the contract holder to produce proof of ownership before we can proceed. Company policy. If there's a dispute over ownership of goods, we don't move anything until it's resolved." I thanked Leo very much. The third call was to my mother, who I asked to come to Birch Lane as soon as she could. Then I got back out of my car and walked up the porch steps. Renata was still in the doorway. The 2 moving men were leaning against the truck with their arms folded, no longer moving, and they had the particular body language of men who had been told to stand by and were content to be paid by the hour to do so. "What did you do?" Renata said. I told her I had called Citywide. I told her that as the documented heir to the property, I had raised a dispute over ownership of the goods they had been contracted to move, and that their policy prevented them from proceeding until ownership was established. The color in Renata's face changed. It went through several stages quickly. Then it settled on a particular shade of furious that I recognized from family holidays stretching back to childhood. "You can't do that, I hired them, I'm paying for them." I said, "I know. And they're still here on your dime, not moving anything. You're welcome to call them and discuss." She called them. I watched her do it from the porch steps. I watched her argue, gesticulate, reference her credit card, reference her contract, and I watched the particular stillness of a person being told by a politely immovable dispatcher that their company policy was their company policy. She hung up. She looked at me with an expression I want to describe accurately. It was not hatred, exactly. It was something more frustrated and more revealing than hatred. It was the look of a person who had spent her whole life being the one who moved first and fastest and loudest, and had just encountered someone who had simply called ahead. "Grandma loved me," she said, and her voice broke in a way I did not expect. And here is the thing about that moment that I want to sit with because I think it matters. I believed her, not about the house, not about the will, not about what Eleanor would have wanted. But I believed that Renata genuinely believed Eleanor had loved her, and I believed that in her way, grief was genuinely part of what was fueling this. A real loss twisted into a frantic, entitled, destructive response, by a lifetime of being taught that love was a competition, and possessions were how you kept score. I understood her completely. And I held the boundary anyway. "I know she loved you," I said. "She left you things specifically. Your name is in that will." "Not the house." "No, not the house." "Why does it go to you?" This was the first genuine question she had asked me since the attorney's office. Not a challenge, not a performance, an actual question with actual pain underneath it. I thought about what to say for a moment. I thought about Eleanor's notes in blue ink. I thought about 37 doctor's appointments, and a key on a hook by my door and a woman who drove the same car for 19 years. "Because I showed up," I said, "not to take anything, just to show up," and she noticed. Renata stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she stepped to the side. She did not say anything else. She walked down the porch steps, and she went to her car, and she sat in it, and I do not know what she did in there because I went inside. I walked through Eleanor's house. The boxes Renata had packed were there, stacked in the entryway and the living room. Some of them were things she had no claim to. Some of them were, I would discover, the specific items Eleanor had left to Renata in the will, the jewelry, the items Aunt Patricia's family were entitled to. She had packed those too, but she had also packed things that were not hers. The books. The photograph of Eleanor in her postal uniform. The mantel clock. I did not unpack anything that day. I sat in Eleanor's kitchen in Eleanor's chair with a cup of coffee I made from Eleanor's coffee maker, and I wrote down everything I could see in a notebook, and I waited for my mother. My mother arrived 20 minutes later. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at me and then at the boxes and then at the coffee maker, and she went and poured herself a cup and sat down across from me. We sat there for a while without talking. Then my mother said, "She would have liked this." She meant Eleanor. She meant the two of us sitting in her kitchen after everything, drinking her coffee, not panicking, not screaming, not falling apart. She was right. Eleanor would have liked it very much. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of legal processes, which is to say slowly, and with extensive paperwork. Gerald's letter went to Renata's attorney. Yes, she had retained one, quickly, and the attorney apparently reviewed the will, reviewed Eleanor's documented competency, reviewed the 14 months of clean and unambiguous paperwork, and told Renata that she did not have grounds to contest. I know this because the contest notice that arrived at Gerald's office 3 weeks later was withdrawn 6 days after that. I know because Gerald called me, and I could hear in his careful professional voice the particular satisfaction of a man who had done his work correctly and watched it hold. Renata did not call me. Aunt Patrice called my mother. The conversation, my mother reported, lasted 11 minutes and consisted primarily of Petrus explaining that Renata had been devastated by Aliner's passing and had not been thinking clearly. My mother said, "I know." And then she said, "She needs to return the mantel clock." And Petrus said she would make sure of it. The mantel clock came back via courier service 3 weeks later, wrapped in moving paper, no note. The movers Renata had paid for the full-day booking at Citywide, which I estimated had cost her between $400 and $800, depending on the package she'd chosen, had sat in that truck for 2 hours and 40 minutes before she finally released them and paid the bill for a job not done. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to be clear about that. I did not feel the hot satisfaction of revenge because what I had done was not revenge. I had not planned it. I had not laid a trap. I had simply called a moving company and told them the truth about who owned the property they were being asked to move, and the truth had done what it always does when it is clearly stated to the right people. It had held. 6 weeks after the funeral, the legal transfer of Birch Lane was complete. The house was mine. I stood on the porch on a Saturday afternoon with the deed in a folder under my arm and looked at the street where Aliner had driven the same car for 19 years. The neighborhood was quiet. Someone 2 houses down was mowing their grass. The Bradford pear tree in the front yard was just starting to come into bloom. I had not yet decided what to do with the house. I was not ready to decide. Aliner had been gone less than 2 months, and the house still smelled like coffee cake and old books and the specific wool of Aliner's coat, and I was not going to rush any decision about it. Aliner had not rushed anything in her entire life, and I was not going to start now. What I had decided was what I was not going to do. I was not going to sell it quickly to resolve someone else's discomfort. I was not going to offer Renata a share to keep the peace. I was not going to pretend the driveway morning had not happened, or that the boxed mantel clock was a misunderstanding, or that the Instagram posts about cherishing these moments had been anything other than a long-running audition for an inheritance that was never meant for her. I was going to honor what Aliner had actually built, and I was going to do it at Aliner's pace, which was careful and precise and without apology. I want to tell you about something I found in Aliner's kitchen 3 weeks after the transfer, when I was going through the contents of a drawer that she had labeled, in her precise blue handwriting, on a piece of masking tape on the front. Celeste, read first. Inside the drawer was an envelope with my name on it. Inside the envelope was a letter, 3 pages, in Aliner's handwriting, dated 11 months before she died. She had written it the month after her appointment with Gerald, after she had updated the will, after she had arranged everything. I am not going to read it to you in full, because it is mine, and it is private, and it contains things about my grandmother that I am still not ready to put into words for anyone else. But I will tell you what the last paragraph said, because Aliner would have understood, I think, that this particular part was not just for me. She wrote, "I have watched this family for a long time and I have seen how it works. The people who show up quietly, who ask good questions and wait for the answers, who sit with you when there is nothing to gain from sitting, those are the people who earn the right to be trusted with the things that matter. Not because they performed for an audience, not because they arrived with flowers, but because they were simply, reliably, honestly there. You have always been simply there, Celeste. That is not a small thing, that is everything. The house on Birch Lane has been standing for 50 years because I put good things into its foundation. I am leaving it to you because you are the same kind of person. Put good things into it, and do not let anyone tell you that you owe them something you have already given to someone else." I read that letter sitting in Aliner's kitchen, in Aliner's chair, with the afternoon light coming through her kitchen window the way it always had, falling in a long rectangle across the linoleum she had lived with for 40 years, because she saw no reason to replace something that still worked. I did not cry right away. I sat with it the way Aliner had taught me to sit with things. And then I cried for a long time, the quiet kind, the kind where your chest shakes but your mouth stays shut. Because you have been trained by someone good to hold things carefully, even grief, especially grief. Here is how it settled, because I know you want to know. The house on Birch Lane is still mine. I have been slowly, carefully making decisions about it. Some of Aliner's furniture I have kept exactly where it is. The kitchen table is not moving. The Bradford pear tree is not going anywhere. I had the roof inspected and repaired, the way a leaner would have handled it, efficiently and without drama. Renata and I have not spoken since the morning in the driveway. She posted nothing on Instagram for nearly 3 months after Alina's death, which was, I thought, the most honest thing she had done in years. She has since resumed posting. I do not follow her account. I heard through my mother that she and Aunt Patris had several difficult conversations in the months following the will reading, and that some of those conversations had become arguments, and that the arguments had involved the word exploitation, and the name Renata had not previously known. Gerald Park. I do not know what those conversations resolved. I do not need to. Aunt Patris collected the items Alina left her, the pearl bracelet, her mother's engagement ring, the other pieces through my mother, who arranged a time with notice and was present for the collection. It was civil. Patris thanked her. My mother said, of course. And then, at the door, Patris had said one thing that my mother repeated to me word for word when she called that evening. S.H. E said, Mom always knew what she was doing. My mother said, yes. And that was it. The citywide moving and storage crew, for what it's worth, were completely professional. I looked up the company afterward and left them a review, not for what they hadn't moved, for stopping when they needed to. My mother comes to Birch Lane on Sundays now. She brings coffee. She sits in Alina's kitchen in a chair that is not Alina's chair, and I sit in Alina's chair, and we talk the way Alina taught both of us to talk, which is to say we take our time. We ask questions and wait for the full answers. We do not check our phones. Sometimes I take out the letter and I don't read it. I know it by now, I just hold it. Some things are worth carrying every day. Not as weight. As evidence that you were known by someone careful and precise and completely without illusion, and that they chose you anyway. That they chose you on purpose, in writing, with a witness, 14 months in advance, without telling you until they were gone because they knew you would have spent that time worrying about it instead of just sitting with them. Alina knew me better than I knew myself. That is the whole inheritance, honestly. Everything else, the house, the deed, the letter in the kitchen drawer, that is just the paperwork. The actual inheritance is learning to be the kind of person your grandmother trusted with everything. And then living up to it. That's the story. One moving truck, one driveway, one letter in a kitchen drawer that changed everything I thought I knew about what I had already been given. If someone in your life has ever quietly chosen you, really chosen you, not for what you could do for them, but for who you actually are, go tell them. Today, if you can. You don't always get 14 months of warning. Drop a comment telling me the name of someone who showed up for you without being asked. Share this with the person who needs it. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.